So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and I'll try to keep this moving quickly. Usually when we do these presentations, we talk a lot about our institution, we just brag about what's going on. I thought I'd try to make this a little informative to talk about what's going on in higher education in general, and then how we're trying to react to that as an SIU system. And so we'll talk about kind of some of the major issues we face. And certainly it always starts with money. Finances is the biggest one. Not surprisingly, everybody knows state budget reductions have been common for higher education. You know, for us, from the high point, the SIU system, we've lost about 25% of our state allocation from that high point. If you look at it from a kind of net present value standpoint, it's close to 50%. So a substantial reduction we're getting from the state. That's not unusual. That was true when I was in South Carolina. It was true when I was in Ohio. It was true when I was in Kentucky. That is just a national trend that we all deal with. So I don't complain about a whole lot. It's just the reality of it. What I would say is what it does for us, which makes it challenging, is our revenue becomes less fixed and more variable. So with the fact that when we had the state allocation being 50% or more of our budget, we could count on that money. Now it's very variable based on enrollment, which I'll get to in a second. And that leads to a lot more instability and a lot more unpredictability. I will say, of course, those in Illinois dealt with the budget impasse a few years ago, which was a whole extra set of fun that most of the rest of the country didn't deal with. And that created a lot of issues that we frankly are still dealing with. The other thing we deal with a lot is facilities and needing money for new buildings as well as deferred maintenance. I will say again, we're pleased to have the support that we have in the health sciences building on the Edwardsville campus, as well as communications building on the Carbondale campus. Again, I don't take those things for granted. When I was in South Carolina, the last time they gave money for new buildings, my son was just went into law. He's a senior in college. So that gives you some idea of how long that has been. So again, when we get money for buildings, we don't take that for granted. And we almost never got money for deferred maintenance. And so the support we're getting on both those is incredibly helpful. You know, at SIU, we've actually managed really well, given all of the different reductions in the state, the budget impasse and all of that. I will say last year, we across the system in every location exceeded what we had in our budget. So we did better than what our budget projections were during the pandemic. I have to be pretty pleased about that. I think we've done a good job of putting some reserves aside where we could and making sure that we are set up well financially for the long term. We also are looking at ways we can save money. And that's one of the things I will say is the system we have an advantage. Are there ways that we can use the system and the money or resources across the system or doing contracts together? So if we're looking at bringing on software or something, can we do it together in a way that actually saves us money? So that's one of the many ways as a system we can look at that. As you probably know, the board has asked us to look at a budget model for the system going forward and changing that. I will tell you, I'm also somewhat of an historian, did some historical analysis. Apparently, the best as I can tell, Illinois decided the budget allocation for each institution back in about 1970 and never changed it. No matter what happened with enrollment, no matter what happened. And so for each of our institutions, sometimes that was to our advantage, and sometimes that was to our disadvantage. But that's just the reality. Well, right now, the state is putting together a budget formula committee, which will have 2 representatives from the SIU system as part of that. And that likely will have a big impact on what we do internally as well. So that's kind of where we're headed. So if we're not getting money from the state, then enrollment becomes really the biggest thing that we focus on. And I'll give you some of the kind of historical trends that we see with enrollment. Traditionally, enrollment has gone up for higher education. In fact, if you look from the late 90s up until the early 2011 period, we went up about 25% in enrollment nationally. So we could count on that additional revenue from that. And in fact, from 2007 to 11, when we hit the Great Recession, everybody said, okay, we'll just replace that money and we'll bring in more students. And that happened across the board. And that worked for about 4 years until we got to about 2011. And I've done this analysis on many states across the country. And what you see from 2011 on is certain institutions, the University of Illinois of the world, the University of South Carolina, Clemson, and Ohio State have continued to grow rapidly, and everybody else has gone down, which has created challenges for most of the institutions, with a few, again, being able to grow and continue to kind of build on that enrollment. So that's been a real challenge. As we look towards the future growth, if you talk to anybody in higher education, the one term they all know is the 2025 cliff. You know what the 2025 cliff is? In 2025, the number of high school graduates nationally starts to decline, and it rapidly declines going forward for about the next decade or so. This is fairly predictable. You know, people who weren't born can't be in high school in the future and can't be in college. So we kind of know what's coming. We can see it very clearly. But that's going to create even more challenges. And we don't expect those larger institutions to decide, okay, we'll be nice to the other ones and we'll continue to grow. They're going to continue to grow, which again will make it a little more challenging for us. We also will see that the age of the students is continuing to increase. So a lot of institutions, and this is one of the things we're going to focus on in SIU, are focusing on non-traditional age students a lot more than they did before. And that really is bringing back a lot of times students who went to college, dropped out for one reason or another, and need to get a degree. The thing with that is we need to be much more flexible. The idea that they can come to campus 5 days a week and take classes is just simply not going to work for them. So it's a combination of online hybrid programs. Some of these programs can be very successful. We're looking at how we can grow those, and that not only helps us, it serves the region as well. I will say one of the things we saw last year with the enrollment across the country, at least what I'm seeing in the early data, is almost everybody's retention went down. I think as a result of the pandemic, a lot more students struggled with the online education and dropped out. What that says to me is over the years going forward, there's a group of students out there that will need to come back and need to come back to higher education, and we need to be prepared to welcome them back and provide them an education that fits into their lives. We also are seeing increasing diversity of the students. So we often talk about when the United States will no longer be majority white. If you look under 18, we're already there. So the students that will be coming to us in the next 10 to 15 years, which is about my career projection of how long I'm going to work, they're going to be increasingly diverse. They're also going to be increasingly diverse from a socioeconomic standpoint. We'll be looking to attract more students who are coming from lower socioeconomic classes. And I will say that bigger institutions, those like the University of Illinois and others, traditionally don't serve as many of the students who are either racially diverse or socioeconomically diverse. So that often falls more to the regional institutions. So at SIU, I will say this year was actually, the last couple of years were pretty amazing given the pandemic. So SIU Carbondale was up 37% on the freshmen over the last 2 years. They were also up on transfers this year, up on graduate students. There were only 3 public universities in the state that I know of so far. I'm still waiting on the data on one that actually increased their overall enrollment. It was the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois, Chicago, and SIU. And that's a pretty good place to be. Huge growth of the freshman class in SIU as well. So we're very proud of all the work of our faculty and staff to do that. And again, given this environment I just talked about, the data is actually pretty amazing for SIU. And so again, a lot of good work there. Now, in a highly competitive environment, we need to be, frankly, much more customer and consumer focused. I will say the average faculty member hates when I talk about students as customers, but that is the reality of the world we live in. They are very much consumers and are looking at multiple institutions and looking at what they're going to get. That means increased expectations for housing and dining. Again, it's funny, when I went to my previous institution, they said, we're going to show you the residence halls. I know what they were trying to do is see how horrible this is. My mind went back to the residence hall I moved into in 1983, and I was like, this is great. I would have loved to have had this residence hall. That's not the mindset of my kids when they were going to college. It's very different. Dining, very similar. If you talk to anybody who went to Virginia Tech when I did, you mentioned the word scribe, they start to shiver and shake. It was really bad food. We don't do that anymore. Food is much better. It's much more what the students really want. And all of that's great, but there's also costs associated with that and trying to keep up with those expectations. The experiences that they have, undergraduate student research, which SIU Edwardsville does incredibly well, is much more of an expectation. I don't remember anybody even talking to me about that when I was an undergraduate student. Study abroad is expanding dramatically. Again, I knew no one who studied abroad, but that's an expectation more. Advising, I didn't meet my advisor for my first 2 years of college, but I did not know who my advisor was. That's very different now. So we're investing a lot in these other things to enhance the experience. And I will say sometimes you'll read something about, we're not investing in faculty more, we're investing more in administrators. Well, some of those administrators are the ones running study abroad programs. They're doing these types of activities. So we're not really doing things that aren't for the student's best interest. We're actually expanding the breadth of their educational experience. And that's part of the reason we're hiring some of those people. Obviously, a much greater expectation on technology than there was. Obviously, when I moved in as a freshman, I had a typewriter with record type, and I was the most popular guy in the residence hall. That is not the level of technology expected today. So again, everything we need to invest in technology, and certainly for some programs, the technology that they utilize has become so much more advanced. My previous institution, we were looking at an arts technology building. That's really where the arts is going, is much more technology. And so we needed to invest in that as well. Mental health counseling, the demands on counseling services at every university I've been at continue to increase. And the pandemic certainly did not help in any way, shape, or form on that. So that's another area where we're investing more. Scholarship support. Again, when I was in college, a lot of us were paying full tuition. When I was at my previous institution, we looked at it 1 year. 2% of our freshmen are paying full tuition costs. So the greatest lie you will read is the list of all the tuition costs at the university. It's about the most meaningful list number you have out there, because most students are receiving some type of support, whether it's need-based, merit-based, but there's much more competition. What I've talked about at SIU particularly is we need to be much more sophisticated about how we do those scholarships and tuition discounting, so we are meeting the needs of all of our students. And we're putting together packages that actually make sense based on what their expectations are, and distributing that money in different ways. And again, I think the private universities are on that a little bit earlier, but the public universities, we need to catch up. The next thing, when you're talking about our financial stability, is fundraising. And people often talk about this is, an area where we can really grow, and I think it is. And I'll talk about that in a second. But what is interesting, if you look at fundraising in higher education, we often see these big numbers out there, but most of the money is going where it's needed the least. In fact, Malcolm Gladwell did a really good podcast called My Little $100 Million. It was about a guy named Hank Rowan who donated $100 million to Rowan University, meaning university obviously for him. And he was an MIT graduate. I said, why did you give to MIT? He said, well, they didn't need my little $100 billion. That MIT had like a $2 billion campaign going on at the time. The reality is Hank Rowan's an exception. Most of the largest gifts go to the institutions that need the least. In fact, with every dollar donated to higher education, about 7 cents goes to either Stanford or Harvard. So they get about 7% of all the money donated to 4,500 institutions go to those two. The top 20 get about, I think, half of the money donated to higher education in general. What that means for the rest of us is we're not really going to be able to support our entire budget on our fundraising. That's not realistic. In fact, I looked at most institutions I've been at, and the money that we generate from fundraising probably is about 2% of our budget. Now that sounds small and insignificant, and why would we care? It matters a lot, because that money becomes accelerators. That allows us to do certain things. That allows us to pull in a student and we might not have gotten other ones. It allows us to start a project that might be financially viable in the long term, but needs a little bit of money on the front end. So really where fundraising helps us, and this is the word we start to use all the time, it's our accelerator. It's the thing that allows us to do something that will have a great impact in the long term, but we need to help our donors to do that. So again, and we need to start thinking about this more and creating more relationships, and think about it more as philanthropy than charity. Because that's one of the problems that we have a lot in higher education is we need money, the state's cut us, please give us money. And people will usually give you small amounts of money. Philanthropy is more an investment. We need to get people to see what they can do with their money and how their money can actually make that impact and make that significant change. So again, we have, I think, some thoughts about where we're going as an institution, and using it as an accelerator will really help us out, I think, over the long term. So all of this is kind of discussion has led into what we have right now, which is the outline of the strategic plan. Dr. Gupchup is helping us lead that effort, along with Keisha Butler and John Collis from the Edwardsville and Carbondale campuses. And these are the goals that we focused on. And so we're focusing right now on academic innovation and student success. So what can we do to make this a place that people want to come? And there's a number of things we can do, and some of that is actually working better together as a system. So going back to some of the things I talked about earlier, if we have study abroad programs, why should they be open to students on both campuses? If we're creating some of these programs to bring students back who've dropped out, perhaps we can work together on combining classes, doing things that make it more efficient for us as a system, but also give them more options that they currently have available. So how do we take advantage of being a system to actually enhance academic success? And I will say one of the things that's been good, again, supporting student success as we manage through this pandemic is working together as a system. We really have been able to do things that, again, has as much contact with students as possible, as much face-to-face, and kept students healthy. In fact, we did some analysis of the number of cases of COVID on campuses across the state of Illinois. The best two campuses as far as low number of cases per student was SIU Carbondale and SIU Edwardsville. We were the best two actually in the state. So we managed that very well while still allowing students to have the educational experiences that they wanted. We're focused on anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, I often talk about this as the right thing to do, but it's also, given the demographic trends we talked about, the smart thing to do. We're going to see an increasingly diverse student body. They're going to expect to see an increasingly diverse faculty, staff, administration, leadership. They're going to expect that we're addressing some of their needs and concerns as well. And so again, it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. We're very focused on community impact. I'm a big believer that as a public university, that is has to be one of our priorities, not just kind of educating students, but giving back to the community. Recently, we developed the Institute for Rural Health and the Office of Community Engagement. Both of those are designed to really use the resources of the system to help out our local communities and local regions to improve healthcare, to provide access to much needed services and grant writing in some cases to help communities move forward. We're looking for any way we can actually help out the communities in the area to be more successful, utilizing the resources and expertise we have. I want to continue to focus on that research, creative activity, and partnerships. Again, providing both opportunities for students and our faculty. And again, as we saw throughout the pandemic, the number of times some of the research we did quickly was able to help out with some of the things going on to help the state deal with the pandemic. Again, it was a long list of those that we're able to do. Obviously, we want to make sure that we maintain the really strong faculty staff we have. So this past week, we actually put our faculty and staff salary increase across the system. That's the first kind of across the system increase we've had probably in about 8 or 9 years, where everyone across the system actually got an increase. So again, focus on keeping those people. And then again, focusing on the infrastructure and support and finding ways, again, as a system, we may be able to reduce some of those costs so we can invest more money into students. So again, move through that fairly quickly. If there are any questions, or if we have time for questions, we'll be happy to take some.